Okay, so now we switch to English as we're glad to have the author of Blockchain Revolution and one of the visionaries of blockchain, Alex Tapscott, with us. Welcome, Alex. Welcome to Munich, coming in from Sydney directly and flying then farther to Toronto, as I understand. Thanks for stopping by and for presenting your book, which came out in German yesterday. Welcome.
Guten Tag. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to Ventum for hosting. This is actually the Blockchain Revolution German launch event that you're all at. You didn't know that, but this is a very big deal. It's a pleasure to be here for a lot of reasons. One is I've actually been spending a lot of time in Germany recently, especially in the south, and I've enjoyed the food, the beer, and the warm hospitality. So this one is certainly no exception. It's also a very exciting time to be a business leader because it appears that the technology likely to have the greatest impact on the world for the next 20 years has arrived. And it's not mobility, big data, machine learning, robotics, or even self-driving cars. It's actually the technology behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, and it's called the blockchain. So prior to today, who had heard of this thing, blockchain? Just raise your hand. I'm sensing a theme here. Well, that's very good. So who thinks that they understand it really, really well? Isn't this the blockchain event? I mean, aren't you guys? So my hope is that, a year from now, 5 years from now, you'll look back on today as the first time, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, as the first time that you finally understood this technology, in the same way that you might recall a presentation or a conversation that you had 20 years ago where someone finally explained the internet to you, because blockchain represents nothing short of the second generation of the internet. So when you use the internet today to send and move and share information, you're not actually sending an original, you're sending a copy. And generally speaking, that's okay. In fact, it's one of the big benefits of the internet, which is that we have a printing press for information. So if you send an email to one person, you can send the same email to everyone. If you host a website, anybody can access it. Except when it comes to things of value, like, say, money, sending a copy is a really bad idea. If I send Ballant $20, it's really important that he knows that he has it and I don't still have it. And I can't send the same $20 to every person in this room, because if I could, then that $20 would be worthless. So it turns out that it's great to have a printing press for information, but it's not so good to have a printing press for money. And this is something that cryptographers and computer scientists have been trying to resolve for about 20 years. It's called the double spend problem, or the double payment problem. How do you make sure that when you send something of value that you're not leaving behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs? And it turns out it's a difficult problem to solve. So even today, we still rely on intermediaries, middlemen, to sit in the middle of transactions and perform a variety of very important roles. The first thing they do is they establish the identity, who's the buyer and who's the seller. The second thing they do is they create trust between those parties. After that, they perform the business logic, the clearing, the settling of transactions, and finally they keep records. Records that can be verified and audited by the parties in the transaction, but also by important stakeholders like regulators and auditors. And overall, these intermediaries do, you're gonna have to excuse me here, I'm gonna have to cut off some of this, but overall they do a pretty good job, but they have significant limitations. The first one is that they're all centralized. And anything that's centralized is vulnerable to hacking or to attack or to failure. And this happens in basically every single industry. We see it with LinkedIn, with Yahoo, with Morgan Stanley, with the Democratic National Committee, with the NSA. If the NSA can't secure its computer systems, what hope do any of us have, frankly? The second thing is that they slow things down and they cost money. So in the case of, say, sending money overseas, country to country, it can take a few days and cost upwards of 10%, which is odd. We use the expression cross-border payment, but nobody ever says cross-border email. But it's just information, and yet one takes much longer and costs much more. They exclude big parts of the global population from the economy. There are 2.5 billion people in the world that don't have access to any form of financial services, and that's problematic. They capture data about individuals, which prevents those individuals from using that information to organize their affairs, but can also potentially be used to undermine their privacy. So you can argue in some that intermediaries capture what I would call an asymmetric benefit from the first generation of the internet, and perhaps more so even than in the pre-internet age. So what if there was a vast new global platform based on a distributed ledger, basically a giant global spreadsheet, that didn't run on any one single computer like inside of a bank, but rather ran on many computers and wasn't accessible to a few, but was accessible to all or to many, where not just information, but literally anything of value, money, stocks and bonds and other financial assets, titles and deeds to property, intellectual property, even votes in an election can be moved, stored, and managed securely and privately. And where trust was not established by a third party, like a bank or by a government, but rather through mass collaboration, consensus, cryptography, and clever code. Well, in 2008, the global financial system was on the brink of collapse, and somewhat propitiously, an anonymous person or group of persons named Satoshi Nakamoto outlined this thing called Bitcoin, which is basically just designed to be cash for the internet, a bearer instrument that people could use to do transactions peer-to-peer. In the same way that if you were to go down and get a pretzel on the street and hand the guy a €5 note, you're not using a bank or the Visa network to do that transaction. It's a peer-to-peer transaction with a bearer instrument. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin was that it worked. And it worked so well that it set off a spark that has captured the imagination of people in many industries, including many of the industries that you all work in today. So Bitcoin is many things to many people. And a good analogy is the parable of the elephant, which is an Indian parable that basically describes a group of blindfolded men all standing around an elephant. They're all touching a different part of the elephant. One person's touching the leg. He says, it feels like the trunk of a tree. Another one's touching the tail. It says, well, that's a snake. And one's touching the ear. It says, that's a palm frond. That's kind of how it is with Bitcoin. So people think of Bitcoin as a speculative asset. It goes up, it goes down. You can buy it, you can sell it, you can make money on it. And that's true. And that's interesting if you're a speculator. More interesting is it's a cryptocurrency not issued or controlled by a government, which is very interesting if you live in a part of the world where the local currency is unreliable, which there are hundreds of millions of people that live in that kind of regime, or if you're looking to send money overseas and not pay 10%. But most interestingly is it's based on this technology called the blockchain. So how does all this stuff work? Well, I don't need to explain it to many of you. You are familiar with it. But just to go through it briefly, it starts with a distributed ledger, basically a record of all the transactions that have happened in the past and are currently happening on the network. Every so often, kind of like the heartbeat of the network, those transactions are batched together into a thing called a block. That block is then broadcast to the community, and there are members of that community who are tied into it who use large computing resources to work collaboratively to reach consensus on what is true. And for doing so, they're rewarded. And so in the case of Bitcoin, it's with new Bitcoin. But there are other examples where you have industry consortia who might just, their reward rather for committing computing resources that they get to be a part of this and participate in the large cost savings and efficiencies that might be part of that network. Once the transactions in that block are validated, that block is added to a chain, which goes back to the beginning of the blockchain. The information in the block needs to reference the information in the preceding block, which is important because it means that if you wanted to hack this record of transactions, it wouldn't be as easy as jumping over a firewall and moving a number in a database. You'd actually have to rewrite the entire history of commerce on that blockchain all the way to the beginning of time and do so in a very short period of time, which is very, very difficult. And then finally, those transactions are time-stamped so that any attempt to alter when a transaction occurred is reversed. So that's kind of how Bitcoin works. Of course, there are many other ways that blockchain technology is being implemented. One of them is Ethereum. So who's heard of Ethereum? There's a great German connection to Ethereum, which is that Berlin is the European capital of all development on the Ethereum ecosystem. But Ethereum actually started in Toronto, Canada, by a 19-year-old college dropout named Vitalik Buterin, who had this great idea. Basically, he loved Bitcoin. He was very active in the Bitcoin community, but he saw limits to it. He thought, well, if we've got this way to move value in the form of Bitcoin, maybe we can use this idea of distributed trust to do more. Maybe we could program it to move other kinds of assets. Maybe we could even program it to do contracts. And this is where the idea of smart contracts came about. Ethereum was a big pioneer in this area. So a smart contract, as I define it, is basically software that mimics the logic of a contract with guaranteed execution, enforcement, and payments, and where you don't need to rely on a bank, a law firm, an escrow agent, a court, or any other traditional intermediary. So Vitalik had this idea. He put together a little crowd sale, invited all his friends to participate, made it public on GitHub and on Reddit and other forums, and was successful. In fact, in a period of 6 weeks, he raised 18 million US dollars. And today, fast forward 18 months, and Ethereum is worth over $1 billion and is widely used by Fortune 500 companies, including some of the folks in this room. Hyperledger is a project that is pioneered by the Linux Foundation. So Linux has been involved in the development of technology that lives in every operating system and every phone in this room, and every single operating system in the world. So they know a lot about scaling, massively scaling an open source technology, and they're doing the same with blockchain to create enterprise, industry-grade blockchain applications for businesses. So given the potential of this technology, it's no small wonder why a lot of stakeholders and media outlets are jumping on board. So The Economist ran a story 12 months ago calling blockchain the trust machine. Oh, by the way, if you make it under the cover of The Economist, you've made it. The technology's for real. The only thing that's a better indicator is a Dilbert cartoon. Because once you're at Dilbert, like, you're set. So they ran this article calling blockchain the trust machine, the great chain of being sure about things, and basically said that this was a technology that was analogous to double-entry bookkeeping or the joint stock corporation and the impact it could have on business. And those two innovations happen to be the foundation of, our economy today. So in the book, we outlined a number of different ways we thought this technology could change the world for the better. Everything from bringing billions of people into the global economy to resolving issues around land titling, where 70% of people who think that they own land in the world actually have a flaky title, in the sense that they don't know whether or not their title will be enforced, whether or not the government has a record of their ownership, whether or not there is a competing claim. And that's problematic because your home is not just the roof over your head. It's also a source of income. It's a way to access credit, to pay for education, or to start a business. So this is a big opportunity. My focus today is going to be on what this means for business. So this is a Nobel Prize winning economist. His name is Ronald Coase, who asked a deceptively simple question. And for answering it, won a Nobel Prize. The question was, why do we have firms? Why do companies exist at all? If the best way to organize capability and allocate resources in an economy is using a market, which most economists would agree is, how come all the different functions of the company aren't independent contractors bidding with each other in an open market to discover best price and do so in the most efficient way? And he said, the reason is transaction costs. So long as it's cheaper to do something inside the boundaries of the firm than outside, companies will continue to grow. So in the early days of capitalism, the big industrialists like Henry Ford kind of understood this implicitly, which is why the Ford Motor Company didn't just make cars. They also had a steel plant and a timber mill and a rubber plantation, because Henry Ford understood it was cheaper to keep everything inside of the firm than to do so in an open market. And that was basically the structure of the industrial age corporation. Now the internet began to change that a little bit by dropping the cost of search. and the cost of communication and collaboration. So that the mantra of the 90s became focus on what you do best, outsource the rest. And the firm began to unbundle a little bit into eventually turning into business webs, where you didn't think of your firm as having all the capability inside the four walls, but rather you could partner, you could outsource, you could offshore, you could build a network of value which would confer competitive advantage. Except, I think if you look at the company today, it doesn't actually look that much different than it did 25 or 30 years ago. There's still a lot of vertical integration, a lot of the capabilities still inside of the company. And that's because a few of the big transaction costs that Coase pointed out, namely the cost of contracting, the cost of negotiating and enforcing contracts, and the cost of establishing trust, the agency costs of doing transactions, haven't actually declined all that much with the internet. The internet was supposed to transform the firm, and it definitely transformed many industries, but it didn't actually change the nature of the corporation. We think with blockchain that it could. And there are a number of other really cool technologies that are coming about now that could make that possible. So smart contracts, as I described, combined with autonomous agents, which is essentially just AI performing many of the roles that individuals might perform in a firm, could lead to radical new business models, which we described in the book as distributed autonomous enterprises, which admittedly we thought was slightly out there. This idea of companies and bots contracting with each other peer-to-peer using this new technology, it seemed a little bit radical. The day that the book went live, though, this thing called the DAO came into existence. So who's heard of the DAO? So you guys know that there were no problems with the DAO. It's totally problem-free. The DAO is a case study in why some startups succeed and some startups fail. But the goal of this organization was to develop basically a radical new model of organizing the firm. So the company had no people, it had no assets, it had no managers, it had no home office, so to speak. It was basically designed as a venture fund that would make investments in the blockchain industry and was accepting money from a global investor base of tens of thousands of people. And I think that the DAO as a model for organizing the firm could work, but there's something that's really interesting just about the success of the DAO in fundraising, which is that we've heard about how crowd sales like at Kickstarter and Indiegogo are changing the way that entrepreneurs can get financing. But we haven't really seen sizes of deals of more than sort of 10 or $15 million. The DAO in 6 weeks raised 165 million US dollars from tens of thousands of investors all around the world. So what does that mean for the world of investment banking and venture capital when all of a sudden a company can tap this vast global resource of investors and raise a big institutional caliber amount of money? We think that that new form of fundraising can turbocharge entrepreneurship, as can this new model of organizing the firm. So let's talk about some new business models. So we've heard about Uber and Airbnb and Lyft and TaskRabbit as part of this so-called sharing economy. And it's a nice notion, that we all get together and we share in creating value and we share in the value that's created. But it's a bit of a misnomer. In fact, I think that these companies are not successful because they share. They're successful because they don't share. They aggregate. They aggregate excess capacity. Rooms in people's houses, handyman skills, cars on the road, through a centralized intermediary company, and resell it to a willing market. It's a brilliant business model, but it's not sharing. And in the process, they capture all the value. So they take 20% of the fee, which might not seem like all the value. When it comes to the $65 billion that Uber is worth, it's not shared by the drivers, of course. It's aggregated in the hands of a few people. So with these models, Airbnb and Uber, we think that the disruptors could become disrupted. And so in the book, we outlined this idea of what might an Uber, a distributed autonomous enterprise Uber look like. And we basically called it Suber. And the only thing I think that needs improvement is the branding for Suber, because she looks terrified in this photograph. I don't think anyone's going to be taking a ride with us anytime soon. But if you kind of think about what does Uber really do? What does Uber really do? I think it kind of does 5 things. The first thing it does is identity. So you log into Uber. Who here, has everyone used Uber here? Who has not used Uber? I think there may have been an age component to that. Sorry, no, you're very youthful looking. So you log into Uber, you see the driver's name, kind of car he's got, where he is, identity. Then you got reputation. You know whether or not that driver has a 4 out of 5, or 4.5 out of 5, or 5 out of 5 star rating. And he knows the same about you based on your history with the service. The third thing it does is contracting. So if you take an Uber somewhere, and the driver picks you up where you said you wanted to be picked up and takes you to where you want to go, you're going to pay. If Uber cancels the trip, then you don't pay. There's a little micro contract that Uber's enforcing every time someone takes a ride with Uber. The fourth thing is payments. Integrated to the back end is Visa, and MasterCard, debit, and PayPal, Apple Pay, to make the payment basically frictionless. And then the fifth thing is the everything else. So, they just delivered 50,000 bottles of beer using a self-driving truck. I don't know if you saw that. So the first four things, identity, reputation, contracting, and payments, can be radically simplified using this technology, which would drive the cost, the agency cost of what Uber does, down significantly. And Uber and Airbnb understand this, and in it they see an opportunity. So Airbnb purchased a blockchain development company to try and exploit this, mainly around the identity and reputation, because they don't want people who they don't trust trashing the homes of people who rent their rooms out, which makes sense. But the real question is, why couldn't someone just disrupt the disruptors themselves and create an alternative model to this altogether? The rights creators. So musicians and artists have never really had a good deal, dating back to the days of Medici. They've always kind of served at somebody else's pleasure. In the 50s and the 60s, artists signed deals with powerful record labels where they negotiated royalty deals of 5% or 10%, whatever, for the license to use their content. And looking back, at the time it didn't really seem like a good deal. But looking back, it was kind of like the good old days where artists actually got paid something. The internet came along and was supposed to solve this problem of them taking a small cut by disintermediating labels and allowing creators to sell directly to their fans. Except the internet took something that was an asset that you got on an LP or a CD or a tape and turned it into a free commodity that could be pushed through the printing press of the internet, and therefore reducing the value that artists got significantly. So a whole new crop of intermediaries stepped in, like Apple Music and Spotify and Rdio. Except today, artists get paid even less than they did in the past. So in the 80s, if you wrote a hit single and it sold 1 million copies for $1 a piece, you could expect to make $45,000, 4.5%, if you were the songwriter on that track. Today, that same song plays on Spotify, gets 1 million streams, you don't get $45,000, you get $36. So this is an unsustainable model. What possible role could blockchain play in the music industry? So this is Imogen Heap, who's a Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter. She's sold millions of records. And she's working now on a startup called Mycelia that basically wants to imbue songs with intelligence. Songs are already digital. There's music and content in the song that you download. Why couldn't it also include information about licensing and royalty rights, where it would say, depending on how it was consumed, a certain payment got executed. So a stream, it costs 1/10 of a cent. You download it, it's $1, like it is today. You play it on the radio, there's a different licensing regime. You sample it for a different song. You want to use the music in a commercial or in a film. There's a different licensing requirement for each side. And then you've got the royalty split. So the songwriter gets 20%, the lead singer gets 20%, the studio musicians get 5%, etc. And every time a song is consumed, regardless of how it's consumed, it executes a smart contract that delivers a payment from whoever's consuming it to the creator of content first. So it would mean that artists would get paid first, which is already a huge improvement, and would get paid fairly if a transaction occurred. Now, this doesn't resolve the issue of people sharing music and music being free, but it does mean that whenever there is a payment, whenever someone's actually paying for content, that the creator gets paid first. That it doesn't take 12 to 18 months, and it doesn't have to go through 9 different intermediaries, which is how it works today. And this model could apply to other resources. It doesn't just have to be content and songs. It could be if you make a contribution to the Linux kernel that gets adopted. Or how about Wikipedia? You make an entry into Wikipedia, and it executes, if it gets adopted, it executes a smart contract that ensures you get paid. Wikipedia is this great resource that humanity has created, but it's in trouble. It's in financial trouble, and that's causing the quality of the content to decline. So a new model of monetizing and ensuring that creators get paid could help a lot. So the re-intermediators, there's a prevailing belief amongst a lot of people that blockchain will disintermediate banks and other traditional financial services players. And that might be true for certain use cases. You know, if you sit in the middle of a transaction, you clip a fee because you've always clipped a fee, you're not really adding much value, you're probably going to lose out on that. But there are as many opportunities, I think, to put yourself back into the middle and add value in ways that you might not have in the past. So the largest flow of funds into the developing world is not foreign aid or direct foreign investment, it's actually remittances. $600 billion a year, growing at 10%. The average fees for remittances that get sent from places like Canada and Germany to the developing world are around 10%. So that's $60 billion cost. And it turns out that that cost is being, it's the burden of people who can least afford it. According to the World Bank, remittance payments are used for food, education, shelter, medicine, etc. So it's not just an economic issue, it's a social issue as well. So there are companies now like Abra who are trying to solve this problem by creating services using blockchain that both solve these problems but also add lots of value. So Abra is an app where you can take a direct deposit from your bank into your Abra account. You can initiate a payment in whatever currency. If you live in Munich, so you'd see euros on your device. And you would send a payment to your family in wherever, Angola. And they would see it in their local currency. In the middle is the use of the Bitcoin blockchain, basically a conversion from Canadian to Bitcoin and then back into the local currency. And it doesn't cost 10%, it costs 25 basis points. And it doesn't take 5 to 7 days, it takes 5 seconds. And what Abra's done that's really interesting, which is an example of adding value on top, is that they've developed a sharing economy model, where if you've got money, let's say it's Filipino pesos, but everything you pay for is in cash. You take the bus, you pay in cash. You go to the market, you pay in cash. You might even pay your rent in cash. So having Abra dollars captured on an app is not that effective. So Abra's allowed anybody to become a teller, where for a fee that you set, you can swap virtual for physical pesos, and usually the fee settles in around 1 to 1.5%. So this is a system that takes the fees from 10% to about 1 to 2%, and takes the time from 5 to 7 days to, call it half an hour by the time you've converted the money. It's a big step function improvement, and I think it means that companies like Abra will be very successful in this market. This is another really interesting application, which is that of the $600 trillion of fraud that's committed in financial services and supply chain, half of it is on the supply chain side. And this is a big problem in the food industry, where it's very difficult to know the provenance, the origin of ingredients that go into food. So you end up with lead paint and baby food coming from China, problems like this. So what if you could combine RFID technology that allows you to label food at the source with a system that allowed you to hold an incorruptible record of not only what the origin was, but where it traveled through the value chain. So you could know basically when you're eating a cheeseburger, right down to the cow, what meat was in it. Now you might not want to know the cow or the name of the cow. Makes it a bit too personal. But this is something that could reduce cost and friction, but could also be a big health benefit as well. And there are other examples too. In the diamond industry, if you buy a diamond engagement ring for your fiance, you really want to know that it's from Canada or Australia and not from Sierra Leone. Or if it's from Africa, that it's from a place where it was mined in a sustainable, fair trade kind of way. And that's something that has proven elusive. So you can do the same thing with diamonds. And so there's a company, Everledger, which is working with IBM to put this into play. I think you could argue essentially that the blockchain is the new supply chain, and the benefits for business are significant. So if you're able to track from the origin point through the value chain where something came from, you'd be able to cut back on illegal goods, counterfeits, reduce the number of times that something circumvented a tariff or some checkpoint along the way, and as a result, reduce the cost for business and reduce the cost for consumers. The Internet of Things is another hot topic these days, this idea that in 5, 10 years there will be hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of devices talking to each other and doing everything in our lives, from organizing our affairs to generating our electricity to driving us around to conducting, or to managing our health, all this kind of stuff. And for those of you who followed the news in the US a week ago, the internet collapsed in the United States because a bunch of low-tech IoT devices, like baby monitors, were hacked. And they used baby monitors to take over the internet and shut it down for a period of time. So that's a problem. So if we're gonna have all these different devices that are gonna be this important to our lives, and they're going to be moving and sending and storing really sensitive, important information, and maybe even value, doing transactions between each other, they need a native digital medium that is secure and frictionless to do that. And there are practical implications of that too. If you've got a light bulb in your home that's generating electricity from your neighbor's solar panel, and it's buying it at 1 cent a day, that transaction is not going to clear and settle on the Visa network, where the interchange is 30 cents. It needs a native format to move that value. So we argue the Internet of Everything needs a ledger of everything. So let's consider just quickly the power industry. So the old model was kind of like the old model of the firm: large, centralized, big economies of scale. It was more efficient to generate power in one central location than it was for every person to have a coal plant in their backyard, obviously. But that model's starting to show signs of wear and tear. Number one, it's burning, most of them are burning fossil fuels, which is problematic. But the bigger issue is that they're vulnerable to failure, and they're inefficient in the sense that the energy has to travel really long distances to get to where it's consumed. And a lot of it, because of just physics, the electrons literally evaporate off of the power lines. So you've got companies now in New York, San Francisco, and probably in Germany, and I just don't even know about it, that are looking at developing, and this would be a great place to do it because solar panels are huge in this country. I drove through the Bavarian countryside 10 days ago, and there's like more solar panels than cows now in Germany. So let's just talk about this one. So Brooklyn, the Brooklyn microgrid is a project where you've got hundreds of houses and businesses in Brooklyn that each have solar panels on their roof, and they're generating electricity. And any electricity that they use in excess of what they need doesn't get sold back into the grid at a wholesale rate. They've got a way to basically take it, bundle it, turn it into a digital asset, and allow individuals to trade it in an open market where the market sets the best price rather than a big regulated utility. And they've gotten tons of press, of course, about this. And it's a model that could work. It could be massively scalable. It'll probably be more successful in a place like Bavaria, where there's big solar investment and where the cost of generating electricity has declined, but probably even more so in places like the southwest of the US, where it's actually sunny. And where people live in homes where like the roofs are 1 acre in size because they're huge ranch houses. Brooklyn, I can't think of maybe Canada, but the worst place in the world to do this. But it's already working in Brooklyn, it could work elsewhere. So the financial crisis happened 8 years ago. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in September of 2008. But the crisis still looms large over our lives in a lot of ways. And this is especially acute in places like Europe, where last month, the youth unemployment numbers out of Spain were 45%. This is a social crisis, I think, and it's led to the rise of populists in the US and France and elsewhere. So there's no silver bullet to fix these problems, but we can start by addressing some of the big issues that exist in the financial services industry. And one of them is not so much bad actors as it is bad design. So this is a Rube Goldberg machine, which is essentially just a contraption that performs a whole bunch of unnecessary crap and in the end solves like a really simple task, like it cracks an egg or it closes a door or something like that. This is basically how the financial services industry works. You know, where you go to Starbucks, you get a card, tap your card on their card reader, you think it's executing this nifty digital payment peer-to-peer, Starbucks is getting the money. Of course, that's not true. It's becoming a data stream that's going through at least 5 different intermediaries: the acquiring bank for the merchant, your bank, a risk management company, a payment processor, a settlement engine, the Visa network, etc. And it doesn't settle instantly, it settles in 2 to 3 days or 4 days, and it doesn't cost 0, it costs 2%, or for some online merchants, the interchange can be as high as like 8, 9, 10%. So that's a big problem. High frequency traders. Another example where we think there's lots of digital innovation happening, where the guys in the States put their trading desks not in Midtown Manhattan, but in New Jersey, next to the server farms that NASDAQ runs, because the difference between being 5 feet away from the server than being 5 miles from the server is enough to give them a 1 nanosecond advantage. I mean, that's like, to me, that's a very cynical industry. But the point is that they've created this model that seems like it's super high tech. But when it comes time to settle that transaction and whatever security that they're purchasing, it settles to T+2 or T+3, you know, in the same way that if they were a retail investor in Iowa, you know, buying stock for their 401k or something like that. So it turns out that basically every single part of this industry can be transformed. And you know, the exchange of value in stock exchanges, or the conducting of payments, are just 2 of 8 different examples. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all 8, but the good news is that you will each have a copy of Die Blockchain Revolution to read all about this. So the final thing is data. So there's a revolution happening in the US, the fracking revolution. Most people think of this as the way to unlock oil that's trapped in tight rock. But there's actually a bigger fracking revolution that's going on that's got nothing to do with oil and gas, which is data fracking, which is that there's been this creation of a whole new asset class called data, which is arguably the most important asset class of the digital age. As important as, you know, factories and industrial plant were in the industrial age, or land was in the agrarian age. But it's unique in that we all create it, you know, you, me, everyone in the world, but we don't own it. It's owned by your bank, it's owned by Facebook, it's owned by Google, it's owned by the government. And it turns out that there's a virtual you out there. That's the virtual me. My head is not actually that large relative to my body. But there's a virtual you out there. And the thing is, the virtual you knows you better than you know you. The virtual me certainly knows me better than I know me. I don't know exactly where I went, what I said, what I bought, for how much, to the second 1 year ago. But the virtual me does, and that's problematic. It's problematic because I can't use all of that information, that data, to organize my life. But it's also more problematic because it undermines my privacy. And it means that just by accident, someone could hack it and steal it, and that's bad, or it could land in the wrong hands in a completely legal way, and that can be problematic as well. So what if the virtual you wasn't owned by the intermediaries that you interact with, but rather was something that you control? Where inside of the virtual me, there were a few different versions of me. There was me, the citizen, me, the employee, me, the customer of the bank, me, the user of social media, etc. And I only had to divulge the information that was totally necessary to get access to something. So I want to buy something online. It's not really necessary that the merchant knows all this information about me, or that any intermediary needs to know this information about me. They just need to know that I have the money. You know, go back to the pretzel example. If I give the €5 to the guy for the pretzel and the coffee, he's not asking for my driver's license. He just wants the money. Of course, there are other examples where providing more information about yourself is beneficial to you. Like, say, if you were buying a life insurance policy, or if you were trying to get a mortgage for a house. You know, if you go to the bank and say, I want a mortgage, and they say, all right, tell us about yourself. You say, nope. You're not going to get very far. Right now, at least in the States and in Canada, they rely on a credit score, which is usually managed by FICO or Equifax, these two companies that have this weird natural monopoly on this industry. And it's problematic. Number one, the FICO score just sucks. It's terrible. It's a terrible indicator of whether or not someone will repay a loan. The bigger issue, though, is it's not actually owned by anybody. It's not owned by the individual. It's owned by FICO. And it's information that is aggregated and fracked from all of your past credit history. So what if you could use more information and information that was yours to decide with how it was used to get access to certain services? So you would control your FICO score, of course, but you could also provide your eBay history, maybe your Suber score, maybe your Airbnb credentials, your social media history. All sorts of other information could become part of a more rich identity, which you could use to unlock services. There's a great example in the life insurance industry. Life insurers want to know as much information as they can about the people who they're insuring to set, actuarial probabilities. So if you're 30 years old and you run marathons and you eat vegan and you're a male who makes $100,000 a year, the life insurer might not see the vegan and the marathons, but they'll see the $100,000 a year and the 30. But what if you're, a maniac who doesn't sleep and chews Adderall and smokes a pack of cigarettes a day? It's in the same position. It's hard to get that granular with a lot of that information. So what if you had a way, what if, say, information from your Fitband or from your experiences exercising or whatever could be immediately uploaded to a ledger that everyone could trust, including the person who's pricing your policy? That could lead to them making more informed decisions that could help you with lower prices. So there are lots of examples of how this might work, and work to the betterment of businesses. That it's not just about big data, it's about big data, small data, better data. It's more about building a relationship with your customer than it is relying on the raw processing power and the huge data stores of big digital conglomerates like Facebook and Google. So, usually I say I'm the only person that's preventing you from getting a drink, but this is Germany, so you're already drinking. So I can drone on and on and on and on. So let's just end on this cheery subject of this miserable lot of individuals. So I think that there are a lot of reasons to explain this, but I think that we're experiencing a bit of a crisis of legitimacy in some of our institutions. I think it probably started with the financial crisis, and it's been accelerated by other events, where a lot of people don't necessarily trust that governments and the institutions of governments are acting in the interest of citizens, that maybe they're acting in the interest of special interests. And this is very true in the US, and they have reasons to believe this in the US, because there's a campaign finance law put in place by a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United that basically allows companies to buy elections. And it's problematic because it's leading to this crisis of faith. So what can governments do to embrace this technology? Well, there are lots of things. I think that they should become informed, that they should take a light approach when it comes to creating regulations, that they should use this technology so that they can become more familiar with it. That's all low-hanging fruit. There's a more ambitious idea out there, though, and it's been adopted by a few central banks, the Canadian Central Bank, the Bank of England, to a lesser extent the Federal Reserve, which is this idea of what could we do with blockchain to change the way that money works in an economy. So Mark Carney, in the days leading up to Brexit and the days after Brexit, while everyone was screaming nonsense, was actually delivering a bunch of really seminal speeches and writing seminal papers about the future of the UK and the world economy. And he said in his Mansion House speech, which is the most important speech of the year, that there were two big innovations that would transform the UK economy in potentially very positive ways. The first was fintech, described broadly as technology's application in the financial services industry, but also blockchain specifically, DLT, distributed ledger technology. That's how he described it. And one of the most ambitious things that he suggested was that the UK consider moving the pound to its own blockchain, basically its own cryptocurrency. And this is something that in Canada they're exploring as well. There are many benefits to this. the Bank of England put out a paper that said if they moved 30% of transactions to a native digital currency, they could permanently boost the GDP of the UK by 3%. So today, we found out that the UK beat expectations and is growing at an annualized rate of 0.5%. So we're talking about increasing the growth of the UK economy sixfold in 1 year with one simple fix. It's that easy. So in addition to that, though, there are other benefits, namely reducing cost and efficiency. If transactions settle bilaterally rather than relying on intermediaries, it will reduce cost and friction in the economy, which is good for consumers. That reduction in cost will likely lead to proliferation of new services and the accessibility of financial services to more people. So the industry can do more for less. And then finally, transparency improves legitimacy and reduces risk, where right now there's all sorts of risk in the system. There's settlement risk, risk trades, the risk that a trade fails, counterparty risk, the risk that your counterparty doesn't have the funds to meet the requirement. There's an expression for this named after a German bank called Hertzstat risk. Basically, this bank entered into a bunch of gold trades on Friday, the market went sideways, on Monday they were bankrupt. And then the final one is systemic risk, the risk that all of this counterparty risk in the system becomes aggregated and creates major strain. So this is a radical idea. It's one that probably won't happen first because governments move more slowly, but when it does happen, will change the world. So you can tell that I'm fairly optimistic, and I think you probably all share that view, considering you're here. But there are lots of reasons why this technology might not reach its potential or maybe be sidetracked temporarily. And there are technical reasons. Is it scalable? Can it meet the demands of big enterprise? There are policy questions like how does government respond to the rise of cryptocurrencies? Will they try and regulate it too closely? Will that have a big impact? There are more philosophical questions like, if this is true and there's big disintermediation, what does this mean for employment, for the economy? Do we need universal basic income, or do we need massive retraining programs, et cetera? So there are lots of questions around this technology. The question I have is, are they reasons that blockchain is a bad idea, or are they implementation challenges to be overcome? And I think in each of these cases, there are implementation challenges. They're real challenges, but they're not reasons that we can't make this happen. So what can you guys do? Personal use. So if you don't have one already, I'd encourage you to download a Bitcoin wallet, buy some Bitcoin, just kind of get used to that. I can talk to you till the cows come home about how this stuff works, but if you use it, you'll understand it. The second thing you should do, the most important thing, after you leave here today, is buy my book. In massive volume for all of your employees. You're going to get a free copy. Don't think that excuses you. No, but in all seriousness, immerse yourself in what's happening. Educate yourself. Find out what's going on in your industry. Find out what's going on inside your organization. If you're not the person who's already leading it, you might be surprised at what you find. Get started and start right away. Kind of 3 and 4 here. Start with anything. I mean, I think the best approach is kind of a 3-pronged approach, right? One is launch your own proof of concept with the resources you have internally. Number 2 would be work with vendors who are developing this technology, like Ventum or whomever. The third thing would be find out if there are consortia in your industry, or if not, try and start them, because a lot of this technology will require collaboration across industry. And start now, because it's very likely that the blockchain revolution will happen faster than previous big technology shifts, because all of the preconditions exist for it to succeed. So trust, as we define it, is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity, abide by their commitments, do what they say they're going to do. That's something that is difficult to achieve. Trust is not easy. So if we have a technology that makes it just a little bit easier for everyone to do business, it could be in and of itself transformative. So it appears that once again, the technology genie has been unleashed from the bottle. summoned by an unknown person or persons at an uncertain time in history. This genie is once again at our disposal to transform the economic power grid, change the way industries work, to make the firm better, and to change the order of human affairs, if we will it. So join the revolution if you haven't already. Thanks.